So here we're looking at the essay The Evil of Death by Silverstein. And despite some language here which maybe is a little bit unnecessarily opaque or technical, we're really dealing with a very, very familiar problem. That is the problem that was raised in our reading of Epicurus, and the problem that's been discussed especially by Thomas Nagel in his essay Death. And sometimes it's very interesting to read these things in conjunction with each other, and to note, all these guys have kind of read each other, especially people like Nagel. Everyone's read Nagel's essay on death. Everyone's read Bernard Williams' essay on the Necropolis case, which is mentioned here, which we'll read later on. But it's interesting to see what they take away or how much they acknowledge what they've read. If we look at the first section of this essay, Silverstein is discussing the very same problem that Nagel did in his essay. But he's kind of, without much argumentation, I would say, rejecting Nagel's solution. Let's think back to what Nagel's real problem was in his essay. His problem was the Epicurean idea that one's death cannot be said to be either good or bad for one, because one ceases to exist at that point. And if you cease to exist, you have no perception, no awareness, no consciousness. Perception, awareness, or consciousness is necessary in order for anything to be good and bad for you. If death ends that consciousness, perception, awareness, then death itself cannot be bad for you because you're not aware of it. We saw that the way that Nagel argued to try to undermine the Epicurean position on death, which would seem to result in the conclusion that one's death is not bad for one, that is, death is not bad for the person who dies, was to seek to define the conditions under which it can be said that something is bad for one, and to prove mostly by examples, by intuitively correct examples, that for it to be said that something bad has happened to one, the person to whom it happened does not need to be aware of the bad, nor indeed to suffer because of the bad. His first examples are things like betrayals and deceptions that one never finds out about. And then he has a very striking example of the person who suffers the brain injury and is reduced to the mental state of a contented infant, which is very, at least on an intuitive level, very persuasive example that seems to show that we would say that something bad has happened to that person without that person's being aware of the bad, and without that person suffering any unhappy mental or physical pain, suffering as a result of the bad. You can see immediately that that has application to death, because the problem with death is, how can we say that something bad happens to someone when they die if they are not aware of their death, they do not suffer because of their death, etc. There's really no mention of that solution, at least in the opening part of it. There's a mention of Nagel later on, and what we get from Silverstein is more or less the rejection of the whole idea that you can overcome the Epicurean view of death, overcome the Epicurean principle that one's death is not bad for one, by characterizing death as a loss or deprivation. We saw that Nagel thought that it's quite possible for someone to suffer a loss or deprivation, and therefore a bad thing, without feeling deprived, without being aware of the deprivation, without suffering and being aware of the loss. Silverstein seems to reject that straight away here, and has a different way of trying to solve the problem, that is to overcome the Epicurean view of death, and a different way of thinking about it. But one thing I would like you to keep in mind as you read this is that Silverstein and Nagel are in the very same territory, and in a way they're doing exactly the same thing, they're just trying to do it in different ways. So they're trying to, in their minds, in their way of characterizing things, to provide a rational foundation for our common sense or natural view that death is a bad thing for the person who dies. To put it on a rational foundation That is to say, it's not just something that we all believe, but that we all have good reason for believing. And part of doing that is meeting the Epicurean position and showing the faults in the Epicurean position. So just keep that in mind as you read. Say a few more things about the first half of the essay, and then we'll move on to his actual resolution.